As Gary mentioned, Commodore Haas of the Chicago Yacht Club contacted U.S. Sailing shortly after the Chicago MAC race in 2011 and asked for U.S. Sailing support. So this is now the report of the independent review panel for the 2011 Chicago MAC race. Gary got a hold of a couple of safety at sea moderators and other interested parties and asked us if we could look into this. I was on a conference call, not expecting to be asked to be chairman, a conference call consisting of Sheila McCurdy, Ralph Naranjo, John Rumenier. We had sorry, can't think of his name, and Gary were all simultaneously on the phone, and I was asked to be chairman. I didn't undertake this lightly. I think there's a tremendous amount of responsibility here. We were aided by Dan Nolan and Jim Teeters from U.S. Sailing and Ron Trosbach in areas of technical nature. The Chicago MAC has a long and proud history, 103 races over 114 years. They're quick to point out that this is one of the longest, if not the longest, inland freshwater races, 333 statute miles from Chicago to Mackinac Island. The fleets have ranged from relatively small numbers in the early part of the century up to 460 boats in the Centennial race in 2007 or 2008. There's an extensive race committee support structure that's built to support a race of this magnitude, separate from the normal race committee of Chicago Yacht Club. And they are qualified, dedicated, hardworking individuals, as you'd imagine from a race of this size. To give you an idea of the loyalty to this race, there are 300 members of the Island Old Goat Society, which are individuals who have participated in 25 or more races, 300 individuals. In 2011, there was a large fleet as well, 345 boats, competing in many different divisions and sections, including double-handed, cruising, one design, sport boat, and so forth. Wingnuts was one of those 345 boats. She was built in 1984 by Kiwi Boats. There were 8 boats of her class built. She was designed by O.H. Rogers. This is a very exciting 35-foot boat with a drop keel, fractional rig, and what was her kind of unique feature were the existence of wings that allowed the boat to put the crew further away from the center of buoyancy so she would have more stability. 475 square feet of sail, roughly a 35 by 28-foot waterline, a 14-foot beam, and a 7-foot draft. She was modified, and at the time of her sailing in this race, she weighed around 4,000 pounds with about 1,400 pounds in a deep bulb keel. And this was as a result of some modifications done in 2006, where a 300-pound shoe was added to the existing keel bulb, and 100 pounds was taken out of the rig by substituting a carbon mast. This is what she looks like. You can see the distinctive wings here with a little shadow underneath them. This is a boat that all the members of the panel thought would be an unbelievable blast to sail on a Wednesday night or in a daytime race. Really exciting stuff. And she was well maintained and she was well sailed. Here you see her with a big asymmetrical kite up. You can also see that it's not blowing very hard in this picture, probably 6 or 7 knots, and everybody is on the wing trying to balance that big kite. Here's a sister ship sailing, I think, in the Caribbean, and you can see that in probably 10 or 11 knots going upwind, everybody is out on that wing. Almost everybody. The other thing that you can notice is some turbulence on the leeward wing. When the boat heeled over 22 degrees, the leeward wing started to dig into the water, which really slowed down the boat, and as a result, they tried to sail the boat very flat. Looking down from the masthead, you can see the extreme beam. And what's hard to see in this picture, because the resolution is not great, is that there's actually a hinge along each one of these wings running longitudinally that allows the wings to be folded up so the boat can be trailered legally. Otherwise this is as wide as a sled, but when you fold up the wings, it's actually a legal trailer width. This is Jim Teeters was kind enough to do some 3D drawings of her so to give you a little better perspective of what she looked like. Notice it's a constant chord keel so that it can be lifted for trailering. And again, the wings are obvious. Here's what she looks like, bow on. When I tried to find other boats that were similar to this, I thought back to a boat I used to own, which is a Viper 640. Doesn't have wings per se, but has a lot of flare. The beam waterline is much less than the maximum beam. Really exciting boat for very similar reasons to Wingnuts. And a boat which I turtled off of Santa Cruz about 3 years ago. And it took every bit of the 3-person crew to pull it back over. And I decided to sell the boat as a result of that because it was an inappropriate boat for sailing in the ocean off of Santa Cruz. You might remember this from the 1988 America's Cup. This is when we had monohulls and multi-hulls going at it on the same race course. This is the vessel New Zealand 1 with her, again, wide wings above the waterline. This is an Iridium tracker that was on board all of the vessels in the Chicago MAC. This one device transmitted to Iridium satellites and kept those on land with internet connections aware of the locations of the fleet. But for the second year in a row, the whole system went down during the race, and as a result, this was not available to the search and rescue effort at the time of the capsize. I would point out, I don't think it would have made any difference, but the vessel was equipped, and all of the devices simultaneously went dark due to a human error. This is the approximate course. I've taken some liberties with Google Earth, and I'm not from the Chicago area, so I apologize in advance if this isn't how you get up to Mackinac Island, but I think it's a pretty good representation. You can see that there's a long process of going diagonally north up Lake Michigan through a series of islands, finally through the narrow passage to the island. And that circle indicates where Wingnuts got into trouble on Sunday night around 2300. Zooming in a little bit, you can see that it's to the east of Fox Island, west of Charlevoix, north of Grand Traverse Bay. So the capsize. This was not an unexpected storm. This wasn't something that brewed up on Sunday afternoon and nobody was aware of it. Not only was it predicted in advance, but it was being tracked by everyone that we spoke to, either on cell phones using weather sites, Doppler radar, on iPads, on GPSs with weather overlays, or using NOAA weather radio. This was no secret. And another reason it was no secret is because this storm announced itself very loudly with an electrical storm, which most of the racers said they had seen that much wind at other times, but many of the folks reported that they had never seen so much lightning in their lives. The crew prepared for this by reducing sail, putting on personal gear. Everybody, except for one person who was below decks, had an inflatable PFD with a tether and was clipped into jack lines at the time of the capsize. They reduced sail from a full main in Spinnaker to a full main in Genoa, from a Genoa to a number 3, finally dropped the main as the wind was increasing, and sailed with a roller furling, number 3, and the the main boom was attached with the halyard and was secured. The main was furled. Around 2300, crew members looked to the windward side of the boat on port side and saw J109 get knocked over 80 or 90 degrees as a wall of wind moved through the fleet, accompanied with increasingly darkening skies and lots of lightning. Mark Morley went forward to the forward corner of the cockpit and began furling the headsail and said, "Hold on." The boat was hit by this wall of wind, again with no mainsail up, just a partially furled number 3. Boat heeled over and went to 90 degrees. 7 of the crew members were in the cockpit and scattered more or less uniformly through the cockpit, 4 on the weather side, 2 in the center, and 1 sort of sitting on the starboard side, which would be the leeward side, and 1 crew member down below trying to get some rest. The boat went over 90 degrees, mast hit the water, but instead of hesitating there, as it had in other times when Wingnuts had been knocked over, it continued over. It's the belief of the panel that it simply blew over due to the gust of wind. They saw 65 knots on the anemometer before the mast hit the water. And this is not an example of a capsize where a wave came and hit them and rolled them over with a bunch of breaking white water. This is a condition of excessive wind blowing a high freeboard, lightweight boat over. 5 of the crew members on the deck were able to scramble as the boat capsized and get into either the air pocket underneath the cockpit or get underneath the lifelines or struggle with the lifelines for some period of time, but they were able to get free of the vessel. Crew member down below, John Dent, waited momentarily, saw the boat was inverted, chose not to put on his life jacket, basically dove through the companionway and worked his way to the outside underneath the lifelines. 2 of the crew members, Mark Morley and Suzanne Makowski-Bickel, apparently suffered head injuries during the capsize. This is through the coroner's report that we know this, were likely knocked unconscious and drowned. They were clipped into the boat, into jacklines, with 35-pound inflatable PFDs, tethers, so forth. And they stayed underneath the boat and until they were recovered 8 hours later the next day. That's where they remained overnight. The crew members had a hell of a time getting free of the boat. They were tethered in I'm going to think about my numbers here, 4 out of 5 instances in releasable tethers, which could be pulled with a snap shackle or a quick release at the chest. However, they found it difficult to operate the snap shackle because you have this big buoyant PFD in front of it. They also, in one case, didn't have a releasable tether, and the tether had to be cut by one of the other crew members. One of the other tethers was cut because they couldn't get the snap shackle to open. So there are a number of problems, and this is something that in our recommendations we think that more investigation needs to be done about the interface between a tether, harness, and PFD. If you look at the reported wind speeds, we sent out questionnaires, U.S. Sailing sent out questionnaires to all of the skippers, 177 of whom responded. You can see on this histogram that winds were reported kind of in the 40 to 60 knot range. Many of the winds that are reported less than that were from boats that weren't actually in the center of the storm when it hit. And you can see there was one report of a 100 knot gust. I think we've realized now that that was instrument error, but this was a very severe wall of wind. This is what the Doppler radar shows. You can see the yellow dot is the approximate location of the capsize. Remember, the storm is moving from the northwest to the southeast, sweeping across the lake, and an intense part of the storm passed directly over Wingnut's capsize location at the time that she was capsizing. This is a different type of Doppler radar. I don't entirely understand this, but the fact that you have this blue-white area immediately upwind of Wingnuts is a very bad indication. This is an extraordinarily intense cell. So in many ways, you have the worst of all possible worlds. You have the least stable vessel in the fleet in the highest wind velocity on a race course. Sociable, which is one of the competitive boat or competing boat in the same area, heard a whistle off to weather after the breeze had died down somewhat. They started looking to weather and they saw some flashlights and some strobe lights, and they decided to investigate. They did a couple of quick short tacks and ended up alongside Wingnuts and came upon an inverted 35-foot boat with 5 people on deck, or 5 people on the inverted hull and 1 person clinging to the rudder. And they executed a flawless rescue of all 6 people, communicating with the Coast Guard, communicating with the other vessels in the vicinity, and using a life sling, pulled all 6 of them on board. They acted professionally and selflessly, and as John just mentioned, there's a wide variety of communication means, including text messaging, cellular phone calls using different networks depending on their location to the cell sites, VHF radio, and a spot transmitter, which was the device that actually alerted the Coast Guard and the families of the crew to the incident. So the little spot transmitter was pushed, they pushed the 911 button, and in moments the Coast Guard was notified by the spot agency that there was a problem. This is what the boat looked like the next morning. The Coast Guard had attached some sort of light to the keel, that she was inverted with a slight amount of fuel. Somehow, and we're not sure how this happened, she righted herself in the next 24 hours and was found like this by a boat returning from the finish line, coming back to her home harbor. The boat was well prepared. It had the required EPIRB. Everybody was wearing life jackets. This one life jacket that you see was the one left behind by John Dent down below. You can see it's equipped with the tether. The boat was full of safety gear even after it had been inverted for more than 24 hours. When we talk about stability, there are two key measurements. Limit of positive stability, which is the calculated angle of heel at which the boat is just as likely to capsize as it is to roll back up, and a slightly more complicated concept called stability index. It was found after the 1979 Fastnet race that two factors were sort of involved here, in addition to simply rolling the boat over and seeing when it continued over. One was bigger boats were less likely to capsize because they're just more massive. It's harder to find a wave big enough to knock them over. But the second factor was beamy-like boats remained inverted because they were stable upside down, much in the same way that a multi-hull is stable when it's upside down. I'm going to greatly abbreviate this, but this is dealt with in great detail in both the narrative that John wrote and in one of the appendices. This capsize correction for beamy boats was limited to -5 degrees. In other words, a boat that, for example, had 170-degree limit of positive stability could only get a 5-degree debit for being beamy and light. And so, when the Chicago Yacht Club Selection Committee and Safety Committee looked at the ORR certificate for this boat, it said that the stability index was approximately 101 degrees. If we then plot the stability index of Wingnuts against the rest of the fleet in the Chicago Mac race, Wingnuts is at the bottom of the stability, and the horizontal axis is size. I'm on the big boat side, the little boat side's on the other side. So Wingnuts doesn't stand out from the rest of the fleet. But if you remove this 5-degree maximum debit, you can see that Wingnuts falls way, way below the rest of the fleet. And so the takeaway for the panel was that we may be masking bad boats or unstable boats by inhibiting the range of that capsize index to only a 5-degree debit. One more way to look at stability is to look at the beam to displacement ratio. This is a very simple ratio that you can calculate by looking at the beam of the boat, max beam of the boat, divided by the displacement of the boat in cubic feet of water. That gives you a dimensionless number. A number of 2 is considered sort of the dividing point. Boats that are more stable will have a smaller number. Boats that are less stable will have a greater number. Here you can see Wingnuts is out completely in a different realm from the rest of the boats in this fleet. Finally, if you look at her capsize, this is a lever arm of capsize, her resistance to capsize. You can see that she's relatively tender initially, has a maximum stability when she's heeled over about 45 degrees. It diminishes until she's heeled over 107 degrees. And then any naval architect or person that's familiar with this realizes that she is extremely stable when inverted. Our recommendations are, we have 7 recommendations. First, overall, race organizers should be circumspect about the boats that they invite to race. Safety has to be the primary concern. Secondly, in selection, race organizers need to impose a minimum specification on the crew, as well as a minimum specification on the boat. There was a tendency in our interviews with the Chicago Yacht Club race committee members, actually the Race to Mackinac Island race committee members, that they felt that a really good crew could make up for the shortcomings of an inadequate boat. They didn't say it in so many words, but that was the impression that we got. Race organizers, when necessary, should contact a naval architect and employ their services if they don't fully understand the stability of the boats that they're dealing with. And finally, race organizers should specify a minimum stability index before the boats are allowed to race in the race. The Chicago Yacht Club undertook a rewriting of them a couple of years ago and came up with the MSRs, the Mackinac Special Regulations, and we actually thought that they were quite good. It would encourage the comprehension and the compliance and the ubiquity of the rules to rewrite them. We also thought that there should be a study, as I mentioned, of tethers and harnesses and jacklines. We believe that the Safety at Sea Committee should look into the changing the curriculum, or at least emphasizing the difficulty of releasing a tether when you're underwater, stability and seaworthiness, the roles of the Coast Guard, their assets and response times, and a better understanding of National Weather Service storm terms. Many of the sailors reported that they heard 34 knots, but they had no idea that it was going to be the conditions that they found themselves in. I want to say one thing about the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard got a lot of verbal and other abuse as a result of the response to this. The panel found that the Coast Guard acted according to their rules and did a wonderful job, spent an inordinate amount, not an inordinate amount, but a lot of resources, both in time of men and women, and also vessels and aircraft. And I think it was a misunderstanding, frankly. They had three HH-65 helicopters, two 25-foot boats, a 41-foot utility boat, and a 260-foot icebreaker, and they worked very, very diligently to figure out what had happened. One of the takeaways is that rescue swimmers are not divers, and they are not body recovery specialists. They stay on the surface. There was a expectation that they would dive underneath this inverted boat and release the bodies and bring them to the surface. That isn't their role. As John mentioned, we believe that U.S. Sailing should come up with a sample crisis plan for yacht clubs and race organizers. We also believe that Category 2 races should have mandatory pre-race inspections as well as post-race inspections, and the post-race inspection failures should be not something that you're proud of. They should be posted and you should be dropped from the race results. Final thoughts. As a sailing community, we unfortunately learn a lot from structural failures, storms, and deaths at sea. But as a result, sailing becomes safer, and we must continue to study these incidents and make corrections. And finally, the panel is deeply indebted to the honesty and candor regarding the Wingnuts incident from the crew, the race committee, all of Chicago Yacht Club, the Coast Guard, National Weather Service, and those involved in Wingnuts rescue. Thank you very much.